I'm Bruno Lété, a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund, and I'm very pleased that today we have the pleasure to welcome our panelists and our viewers on both sides of the Atlantic. So good afternoon, Europe. Good morning, America. And for my part, greetings indeed from sunny Brussels. Let me first of all thank our partners in the event, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. GMF is grateful that you approached us with the idea to do something around the topic of today's event, the NATO 2030 reflection process. And we actually hold this event in light of a special moment for the Parliamentary Assembly. You just had your 66th annual session, if I understand correctly. So we at GMF are very glad that we can be a little part of this important event. An event that each year brings together legislature from both sides of the Atlantic and really serves as a transatlantic bridge for ideas and debate. So today we want to discuss how NATO can best prepare for the challenges of the next decade. Secretary General Stoltenberg launched to this purpose the NATO 2030 reflection process, and I would say that such exercise is not a luxury. These are difficult and challenging times for NATO, and the alliance must adapt if it wants to stay relevant and address these challenges. And at this point, the world struggles not only to cope with the coronavirus and some of the security challenges it poses, but there are other things we need to think about. For instance, the increased presence of China in the European security landscape, the continued assertiveness by Russia in key regions, but also new forms of terrorism, hybrid warfare, and cyber attacks. So in other words, it's not only about the guns, the bombs, or the missiles. Today's security is also about hacks, leaks, or disinformation. This is why the NATO 2030 reflection process is so important, because it may or will eventually lead to a much needed update of NATO's strategic concept. The current one dates back from 2010. So in this context, the world has changed a little bit in the past, well, not a little bit, a lot in the past 10 years. In this light, let me also congratulate once again the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I understand that during your annual session, you adopted a declaration expressing support for this endeavor. So in short, in sum, I hope today we can discuss why NATO 2030 is so critical. What are the priorities NATO needs to look at the next 10 years? Or in other words, what do we need to make sure, what do we need to do to make sure that NATO remains the most powerful and successful alliance in history? Fortunately for me, I do not need to answer those difficult questions myself. I'm very pleased to be joined by a bright panel of policymakers, and let me briefly introduce them to you now. First of all, US Congressman Connolly. And let me perhaps also congratulate you, sir, with your fresh election as new president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I understand that the decision was made yesterday, so congratulations. Next, welcome also to Attila Mesterházy, member of Hungarian Parliament, but of course you were the president of NATO Parliamentary before Congressman Connolly. So I really also want to take a minute to recognize your legacy as president. And last but not least, Ambassador Baiba Braže, you are the Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy at NATO HQ. So I'm very fortunate to be your humble moderator in this session. We have about 60 minutes to have this discussion. We'll do a first round of the speakers, but I definitely want to encourage our audience and our viewers to participate. Please use the Zoom chat functions, post your questions. I'll be closely monitoring the feed and transfer your questions to our panelists. So now that this is done, house rules are behind our back. Let me start with you, Congressman Connolly. Why is this a critical time for NATO, and how do you see the priorities of your presidency for the Parliamentary Assembly?
Well, thank you, Bruno. Thank you very much. And let me thank my two panelists as well, Ambassador Braže and my good friend Attila, who just served as the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and really reinvigorated the job and provided great leadership during, an unprecedented pandemic. And of course, as you indicated, Bruno, When we look at the challenges of NATO 70 years on, it's a different world. There are some similarities, but right now we're seeing what a pandemic can do in terms of the challenges and stresses on individual national security and on collective security. And it taxes the system. We have to respond to that and understand the security implications. You mentioned cybersecurity. It has been used to undermine elections. It's been used to engage in a huge campaign of disinformation that has affected everything from referendums to join NATO, to undermining democratic institutions, and to supporting non-democratic political parties in a democratic system in the West. So we have to face up to those challenges. I do believe we're at a critical juncture, both in terms of external and internal challenges. And let me highlight a few. First, the international power distribution has shifted fundamentally, and it's high time for NATO to revise its strategic concept to reflect this evolution. A new strategic concept must take into account the profound degradation of our relations with Russia, following Moscow's aggression against Ukraine, its illegal occupation of Crimea and the eastern parts of Ukraine, as well as parts of Georgia and Moldova. As importantly, we got to take into account the rise of the People's Republic of China. China's unrelenting and rapid rise has threatened to upend the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century, not only in China's neighborhood, but clearly far beyond that. China is already asserting itself on international and regional security issues, including in areas that are important to NATO, such as the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and the high north, the Arctic. China, like Russia, does not share our values. Both countries, in fact, actively seek to undermine the international rules-based order that NATO countries help build and continue to defend, and which supports stability and certainty in the international system. Are we to step aside and ignore China's potential threat to our democratic community? Or are we going to step up and assert ourselves to match China's aggression and assertiveness? The report and resolution, which I presented to the Assembly yesterday during our annual session, argues that NATO should do more than merely take note of China's multifaceted rise. It must develop the capabilities needed to monitor Beijing's actions, engage in dialogue where we can, and when necessary, counter any threats China poses. At the same time, NATO should acknowledge there is scope for dialogue with China. A confrontation is neither desirable nor necessarily inevitable. As we adapt NATO to the changing international environment, including the rise of China, we got to strengthen the alliance internally. And that's the second point. NATO's success over the past 70 years is not only due to its collective security and military capabilities, but also what fuels us internally in terms of a cohesive security alliance are the common values we share and our commitment to democratic liberal values. The emphasis on shared values has been pivotal in maintaining the alliance cohesion for 7 decades and will be decisive in providing a stalwart, robust alternative to the visions proffered by Putin and President Xi of China. Today, the values upon which the alliance has been founded are challenged by external enemies of democracy, but also, more troubling maybe, by internal proponents of illiberalism. These forces aim to undermine the faith in and political support for our allied democracies. It's therefore necessary to strengthen resilience of our societies against those malign influences. Otherwise, we risk gradually undermining the faith of our citizens in Western values, systems, and leadership. In fact, if we allow that erosion to continue internally, what, pray tell, do we stand for? What is this bulwark against Russian aggression in Europe, if we're no different or not much different than the system he's proffering? I argued in particular that NATO should establish a democratic resiliency coordination center to help member states strengthen their democratic institutions and to reinforce those shared values. The center would serve as an oversight body for common values and help provide assistance to those member states or prospective member states on election integrity and security, judicial independence, press freedoms, and other issues important to maintaining vibrant democracies. There is a simple choice before the alliance. Do we adapt to the challenges that will shape the future of transatlantic security, or do we get mired in the internal strife that is the sign of any failing organization? I believe the case is clear that this alliance can and must shake off the forces that seek to pull us apart. To do this, NATO needs to rededicate itself to its founding principles of shared democratic values. The United States Congress, on a bipartisan basis, has been steadfast in its commitment to strengthen this alliance. I can assure you that the next U.S. administration, the Biden administration, will reaffirm the United States commitment to NATO and our unique transatlantic bonds. I worked for Joe Biden for 10 years on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I know him very well. I've known him for 40 years. I know that he embraces American leadership abroad, but he also understands the necessity of partnerships. He is an internationalist. He supports the longstanding alliances that have kept us safe. He respects the values and bonds forged in blood that undergird this alliance. I'm confident that President-elect Biden will demonstrate an early and consistent commitment to the alliance in particular, which came to the aid of the United States in one of its darkest hours in 9/11. Going forward, forums like NATO Parliamentary Assembly will be fundamental, in my opinion, to marshaling the political will required to reinvigorate support for NATO itself and strengthen the democratic institutions that help define the identity of the alliance. I intend to leverage the Assembly's influence into a more active role in NATO, qua NATO, during the next 2 years, and look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Congressman, thank you very much for your very clear propositions. And I really like the fact that you underline that NATO is not only a military alliance, it's also a club of values. So let's not forget that. Congressman, just one short follow-up question, if I may, and maybe this might be interesting for our European viewers on this event. And you already briefly touched on it, given that we are transiting to a new administration. But how does the United States see its relationship with Europeans today? Is there an evolution in terms of priorities?
You know, again, I'm going to reflect on the incoming administration because I think that is what we're going to be dealing with. I believe that President-elect Biden and his team are very committed to cohesion in Europe. They're committed to the European Union as an institution. They want to see it succeed. They want to see a robust, strong commitment to military security in that 2% commitment in terms of defense spending. They want to see a strong response to Russian aggression because the only thing Putin understands is, strength. But I think that you're going to see a renewed commitment to building those institutions. I also want to say this. After the experience of the last 4 years, I would hope and expect that the United States is going to proceed to reinvigorate and to restore partnerships and alliances with a healthy dose of humility. We've been tested ourselves in a way I don't think we ever anticipated in terms of our own internal democratic challenges. And I hope that will give us a new perspective about the challenges our friends in Europe face and approach our relationships with that humility so that it's more of an equal partnership. But I see Europe being critical to the alliance, to the relationship with the United States, and a real deep desire to strengthen European institutions, international institutions, and the EU in particular.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to you, Mr. Mesterházy. You are now speaking to us from Budapest, if I'm not mistaken. But you've been at the helm of NATO Parliamentary Assembly during times that the transatlantic relationship, well, let's say, was tested by some times. So given that legacy, given that experience, what are your perspectives for NATO 2030? Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Perfect. So, thank you, Bruno, and to the German Marshall Fund to host this online event, and as well as the participants for joining the discussion. As Gerry mentioned, we have just concluded the NATO Parliamentary Assembly's first ever online session. 6 days of intense political discussion among 200 members of parliament from the 30 member countries and from other 20 partners. How NATO adapts to remain a political, military, transatlantic alliance unsurpassed today and in the future, of course. And that was one of the overreaching themes for our discussion. 1 year ago, at their December meeting in London, Allied leaders decided to launch a reflection process on ways to strengthen NATO further. They did not know then that this process would coincide with the most serious, profound, and wide-ranging crises which our societies and economies have known in decades. The COVID-19 has taught us important lessons about our ability to sustain major global shocks as societies and as an international community. This pandemic has also confirmed that our nations must learn to better confront a number of new dynamics and new challenges. Among these are the rise of China and our dependence on Beijing in strategic sectors, and the need to better counter disinformation and propaganda. For all these reasons, COVID-19 is a security issue. And during our session, we adopted a number of recommendations on the lessons learned from the pandemic for NATO and individual nations. But of course, the security challenges which predated the pandemic have not disappeared. To the contrary. First among these are Russia's aggressive actions, terrorism, instability in our neighborhood, hybrid and cyber threats, and emerging and disruptive technologies. All these challenges featured high on our agenda too. NATO 2030 offers a timely and important opportunity to ensure NATO is prepared to deal with these challenges and any future ones, and also to learn the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm grateful to the NATO Secretary General for recognizing from the start that the NATO PA is an important partner in this effort. Yesterday, the Assembly adopted the recommendations I presented based on the NATO PA's delegation's input. Our declaration proposes ways we can make the alliance more united politically, fit to tackle the threats of today and tomorrow, and more active in bolstering peace and stability globally. First, to strengthen unity, cohesion, and solidarity, we must rededicate ourselves to our shared values and recommit to address any differences between us. To do so, allied governments should consult more frequently and more often informally. The bond uniting Europe and North America is unique. It is the wellspring of NATO's unmatched political and military strengths. We cannot let it weaken. And we must deliver on the defense investment pledge and on the legitimate call for sharing the burdens and responsibilities for our security more fairly. Second, to ensure NATO continues to adapt to a rapidly evolving security environment. Allied governments should adopt a new strategic concept, taking stock of the major geostrategic shifts in the past 10 years. NATO must continue to counter Russia's aggressive policies and actions while keeping channels of communication open. Allies should embrace a clear-eyed shared response to China's rise and global ambitions. And NATO must respond to a 360 degrees in all domains of conflict and to the whole range of other challenges. Third, and finally, To ensure NATO plays its part in supporting global peace and stability, allies should step up efforts to defend the rules-based international order and work hand in hand with partners around the world from Europe to Asia. To be successful, NATO 2030 must engage our publics, particularly the younger generation, which is why I'm particularly happy that Ambassador Braže could join us for this discussion. The diversity of today's threats and the multipolar world make it more difficult for many citizens to understand NATO's mission and contribution to security. Yet public support is an indispensable element of NATO's strengths and credibility. We must strengthen communication and public diplomacy to explain how NATO delivers security for citizens. And we must back it up with necessary resources, of course. The NATO PEA is particularly well placed to support key elements of this vision, whether it is about enhanced political consultation, rededicating ourselves to our shared values, maintaining public support for NATO, keeping up efforts on defense spending and innovation, or broadening NATO's network of partners. We complement and amplify NATO's action in ways that no other organization can. Thank you very much for listening, and I also look forward to discuss these issues. Thank you very much. Thanks.
And thank you for making some interesting point. And I would like to get back later to some of the things that you said. I hear you saying that we need a broad approach to security, that NATO could or should play also a global engagement role. So these are perhaps points I would like to take again after or when we turn to the Q&A. So thank you. Last but not least, Ambassador Braže, you are part of senior management at HQ, and you are at the heart of all the things that we are talking about here. So I would be very keen to hear your view on this NATO 2030 process, but perhaps also one additional question. You are the NATO's boss for public diplomacy. So may I also ask you what the role of citizens is in this process, of why citizens' engagement matters? Thank you very much. We may need to unmute you, Ambassador. There's a button on the bottom of Zoom. Yeah, there you go. We should hear you now.
Right. Can you hear me?
Thank you, Ambassador.
Wonderful.
We do hear you.
Very interesting. We were not muted, but somebody muted us. So that rarely happens. NATO is not to be muted. Just a few remarks, and I look forward very much to the discussion. It's been a busy time. We are preparing for the next week's foreign ministerial, and it will be an online ministerial, again, due to the consequences of COVID. But because it's the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and because it's GMF that is organizing, we really prioritize this event. And that really shows what NATO is about. When we speak about 2030, Secretary General has clearly said it's about making NATO politically stronger, militarily much more relevant, and globally more engaged with a more global approach. And those three main pillars will intervolve all our work, both in preparation for the leaders meeting, next leaders meeting, whenever that comes, but also throughout the thinking within the alliance, both with the allies, among the international staff, with our military colleagues, and indeed, Bruno, as you said, with civil society, with our citizens, with our youth groups and priority audiences. So it's a comprehensive process, but it will lead to results. What those results will be, we cannot prejudge, but it will be a proper due process. And we are very grateful for NATO Parliamentary Assembly's serious, thorough, proper work in both discussing but also providing its views, and it will be with great pleasure that we will take into account in our work. When we look at NATO, it's of course most successful political military alliance. It protects 1 billion people on this planet. Its military might is unmatched. Its GDP is almost 50% of world's GDP, and half of world's military power. So it's literally the strongest and most successful alliance that has guaranteed protection not only to our citizens and countries, but to also our private sector, to our civil society, to our education institutions. It has been the key why our companies have been able to gain that technological edge globally. It has been the key why we have had Nobel Premium Laureates globally. It has been, and it is the key why other institutional arrangements and other international organizations such as European Union or Council of Europe have been able to enjoy that peace and security that comes from NATO guaranteeing it. When we look at the whole setup, of course, NATO is a transatlantic regional alliance. And while the traditional threats, such as Congressman, of course, spoke about with regard to Russia's systematic behavior of violating international law, have not disappeared, we, of course, have new threats that have emerged and that are of global character, be it cyber, be it hybrids, be it climate change, or we can also say technological developments in space and the use of space as a possible hostile environment against our societies, or indeed China's rise and refusal to share our democratic values and use the international system for its benefits. We all have to take that into account, and that is why we need the global approach. When we look at the future, it will be very much for NATO the work around embracing the emerging and disruptive technologies, while on one hand maintaining our advantages and technological edge, and not excluding this dialogue and cooperation with China and with indeed other countries, because dialogue is what we do as democratic states and the alliance of democratic states. But in the same time, clearly understanding how we militarily and politically are able to maintain the edge and actually advance it. So technologies will be a very important work strand, and NATO indeed serves as the primary platform for the dialogue between North Atlantic and European partners in this respect. Second, climate change. Again, we would need global partnerships, and we need partners not only within the alliance, but outside it, not only democratic states, but also those countries who not necessarily share our values, such as China. So we expect indeed to be able to proceed with this work. NATO will do its part. We are indeed upgrading our technologies. We are looking at the policies and everything in that respect. Security environment that worsens from the negative effects of climate change worsens our security also. So it's indeed in NATO's interest to make sure that the effects of climate change are minimized. When, again, looking at the effect on our societies, and the Congressman already said, the work on resilience is something that we will be working on for the years to come. It's not only about the government and critical network resilience and the ability of the critical infrastructure to recover and our systems to recover from shocks. It's actually about strong societies. And how can our defense and security be strong if our societies are not strong? So enabling our citizens to understand the threats, but also how to counter them, to enable networking, to enable civil societies, to make sure that free, independent, quality press exists and media as such, but also to get the private sector to work with us. As we know, the companies that have grown from the success of our economies of NATO are currently the ones leading the transition and the very much the effects that come from the success affect every citizen. So we need the private sector with us also to counter negative effects from the advance of technology. And indeed, such as distribution networks for the social media, the way algorithms work when people are in their echo chambers, all that is part of the work we will be looking at. With this, I will stop now and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador, for giving us this tour de table, if I may say so, on the issues at stake. And I really appreciate you mentioned technology, because the role of tech and innovation is also changing our armed forces and how we look at security and defense. So by this, I would like to move to our Q&A, and I see that the feed with question is literally exploding. So many people want to contribute, which is great. I will try to address as many questions as I can. One observation I have from the questions from the audience, that there's quite a bit of people wondering about the content of the next strategic concept, or what a strategic concept should include. So I will take some of the questions around this issue, 3 or 4 of questions, and get back to the panel for answers on that. But one participant, Ben Ziff, is asking whether NATO should really focus on broadening its mandate and partnerships to deal with every global issue and region, or should NATO simply do what NATO is good at, hard power? What should be the focus? We have another question from Marcin Terlikowski, who is touching on Russia and China. Mr. Terlikowski is wondering if Russia and China, the strategy towards those two actors, may not be a divisive experience among allies within NATO, because some member states may have different vision on that than others. So that's another question for the panel. How do we deal with Russia and China without it dividing the NATO alliance? There's also quite a bit of questions around the NATO-EU relationship. How will this translate into a potential new strategic concept? And of course, this is a specific question here from Simona Soar, asking if the US administration will focus more on EU security and defense and take into account the EU strategic autonomy. How do we factor that one in? And then the last question that I would like to take for the panel is basically NATO's role in the Black Sea region. Are there any views, opinions on how NATO strategy should evolve towards this? So we had questions about hard power versus being a bit broader in terms of security. How do we engage with Russia and China without dividing the alliance, EU, NATO, EU, US, and the Black Sea? So perhaps I can start with you again, Congressman, and if you could share your opinions on some of these issues. I'm sure our viewers would be delighted.
Well, let me start with Russia. We are a coalition that is committed to collective security. The Russian military, led by Vladimir Putin, invaded and illegally annexed the sovereign territory of a European state, Ukraine. It currently has illegally occupied through, false militias, parts of the eastern Ukraine, Abkhazia and Ossetia and Georgia, and parts of Moldova. Will a European-based transatlantic alliance just sort of pretend that didn't happen? Will it sort of move on and say, well, that was unpleasant, we hope it doesn't happen again, let's move on? I'm sorry, that is not our position. And it ought not to be NATO's position. We need to be firm. That is illegal. We will not accept it. We will not recognize it. And there will be sanctions on the Russian government until they relent. that is sovereign Ukrainian territory, sovereign Georgian and Moldovan territory. And in the 21st century, if there's one red line for NATO, it is that we do not solve problems, especially in the European theater, by brutal force. That's something that happened in the previous century. It's not something we will accept in this one. So to me, that is a bright, shining line. And if we don't accept that, then the alliance is weakened from the start. And I'm not quite sure what we stand for. If it is that kind of very fundamental, basic commitment to collective security and to push back against and resist forcible annexation of sovereign territory in Europe. With respect to, and by the way, what I just said, I hope applies to the Black Sea. I mean, we're seeing illegal acts by the Russian government, including, you will recall, the illegal hostage taking of Ukrainian shipping that goes through the Black Sea. So we can't stand idly by with respect to that. You know, in terms of the relationship between NATO and Europe, I think what we have to strive for is complementarity. And I think that's doable because I think there's a lot of commonality in terms of values and interests. There's been a lot of talk about, you know, creating a separate EU military capability. And from the United States point of view, I think we're agnostic about that. That's up to Europe. However, it cannot, must not detract from the fundamental commitment of our European allies who are members of NATO to their defense commitment to NATO. That has to be number one. Whatever else you do is great, but let's start by finally meeting the commitment of 2%, so that, and better burden sharing, as Attila indicated. And finally, I would just say, you know, in the strategic concept, it has to take cognizance. NATO can't be all things to all people. And we have a clear mission we've got to make sure we're always focused on. But we also have to take cognizance of the fact that in over 70 years, we no longer live in just a bipolar world. There are opportunities, challenges, and threats we could not have envisioned 70 years ago. And one of them I emphasized was China. China is a hegemon. It is very aggressive. And it is, you know, building islands in the South China Sea. Why is it doing that? It's doing that to be able to claim territorial rights that actually encroach on the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, even Japan. And that's got to be of concern to us. China got formal status, even though it's not an Arctic Council member, in the Arctic. Why? It has interests. Now, some of them are economic, but some of them may be more than that. And we need to take cognizance of that. We can't be naive about that. You know, China is this enormous new force in the world. And if you look at NATO documents, we barely even mentioned the word China until a few years ago, as if it didn't exist. It certainly wasn't in our purview. Well, forcibly, China is making sure it is now in our purview, and we need to deal with that. Don't have to necessarily define China as an enemy. In fact, we shouldn't. But it's not a friend to our shared values, and in fact is hostile to those values and is acting such. Look at what's going on in Hong Kong as we speak today. So I think the strategic concept has to be updated to take account of cybersecurity, you know, propaganda, in using technology to undermine our shared values, and internally to make sure we're disciplined in keeping our own internal commitments to those shared values.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for being very straightforward and clear in your thoughts. This was well understood. Mr. Mesterházy, over to you. I mean, you heard some of the questions, and especially in your intervention, you argued for a more broad approach to security. So how would you respond to those that think about, no, let's just do what we do best at NATO, which is hard power? Your microphone, sir.
Yeah, I have to unmute. Thank you. Sorry for that. Yeah, I was just not surprised, but I was happy that at the first round we have the most important and most difficult questions, you know, to pose regarding these issues. So we could talk about, I think, hours and debate about these issues. Yeah, I think I'm a great supporter to have a more global approach, and I supported very much the Secretary General in this regard, because I think that the life is changing, the security environment changing, and we have new challenges, as just the President, Mr. Connolly, said, and we have to adapt ourselves to these new challenges. Of course, we cannot say that we stopped somewhere where we were in the past, even if it was very efficient or we were very good at. We have to, adapt ourselves and our capabilities to the new challenges. And there are some, of course, it was mentioned before, the hybrid warfare, for example, which is quite interesting, or now the pandemic, it could be a biological weapon. So that's also a very important issue. So I know this is a quite old debate, not just now, but some years ago, that we should stay where we are or we should go on. I'm in favor of changing ourselves to be able to cope with the challenges of the new age. And we have emerging challenges. So this 360-degree approach and the more global approach, I think that's the right one. Of course, it doesn't mean that we have to go to the Chinese Sea to intervene, to stick another point there. But still, we have to keep in mind that the security challenges are coming from more global positions, and they're not just in the North America or in Europe. So that's why the routes we have to manage also. So I think, I would agree that we should go on and adopt ourselves. The next one is China and Russia. I think we have talked a lot about Russia, so I pick up with China. We say that China is a challenge and opportunity, and of course not an enemy. I usually say in my speeches that China is more of a challenge than an opportunity for us. And we have to keep in mind that. And of course, we have to organize ourselves that China should respect the rules-based international order. And the question was right on that issue, that it could be China more, I think, could be a divisive issue for a lot of member states of NATO, because that's China in the European Union also, but I think in NATO also China could cause, this issue could cause much more dividing lines than, for example, Russia. So I think it's very important. That's why we had several reports on China this year in the NATO PA, just to be able to see all the sides of the coins. Could you hear me? Yeah, okay, sorry. The NATO EU, I think I just say two words to be short. This is coherence and complementarity. So I think for me, these are the two magic words. And I think that's what the Secretary General also used several times. And I think it's good to have better capabilities in Europe. And of course, we have to spend the 2% of the GDP to these expenditures, and we have to develop ourselves, but still the complementarity is very important, and to have the coherence, EU and the NATO. And the Black Sea, well, actually we had a statement or a point in our resolution declaration, and it said that we have to continue to strengthen the NATO's enhanced deterrence and defense posture in the East and Baltic and the Black Sea regions, and continue to adopt collective defense and deterrence to the new threats, including hybrid actions and new domains of conflict, including cyber and space. So that's our position now regarding the Black Sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador, over to you for some thoughts on these topics.
Thank you very much. Whether we just concentrate on hard power and the traditional threats, or we actually look at the others, we don't have a choice. We have to be able to do all, and we are doing that. The aim, of course, is to make sure that we adapt also for the future threats. When you look what has been happening at NATO the last 6 years, have seen the growth of defense expenditure in real terms across the alliance. And that commitment will clearly continue. We haven't seen negative effects from the pandemic on the commitments on the allies. And quite opposite, our audience research clearly shows that there is increased security threats that is felt by people as a result, not only from the pandemic, but other challenges and threats. So quite clearly, when we look at our existing strategic concept, there are three straightforward tasks, which is collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security that NATO has to do, and we are doing them all. So collective defense, there is not only enhanced forward presence, but there is the whole set of exercises, whole set of very practical work that the allies are doing around interoperability. There is a clear commitment from our US allies to the security of our populations. So, and those who criticize the US government, I can only say that very much the 2% growth and the 2% spending limit has to be there, and it's a commitment that we have given and has to be fulfilled. For the crisis management, we saw that with the COVID pandemic, it was NATO who was able to deliver for the allies, for not only each ally to each other, but also to our civilians, to our medical personnel flying military hospitals and personnel, supplies. So NATO also, while delivering on crisis management in this respect, was able also to show that its deterrence and defense is still strong and not affected by the COVID crisis. On cooperative security, when we speak, for example, on the non-traditional threats or the threats that are there, our task is to strengthen not only our societies, but also our partners. For example, the terrorist threats are there also against our societies, and our people are affected by it. So by ensuring defense capacity building among our partners, be it in the Middle East and North Atlantic region, or ensuring Ukrainian defense capacity building and training in Ukraine, we strengthen our own alliances, security and defense also. So that's why the new and emerged threats and emerging threats, we will just have to be dealing with them. There is no choice. Those are threats that affect us.
Ambassador, let me stay with you for a second, because there are some more questions addressed to you that are a little bit in this context. So some viewers are asking what the role of public diplomacy is to re-energize transatlantic relations. Matthew King, for instance, and I quote, fears that if we do not educate and inform the public of the relevance of multilateral alliances, the vacuum exploited by Trump and other right-wing populists will remain. Quoted. What can we do?
The role of public diplomacy here at NATO, it's a wider role. It's not just public diplomacy, it's around all the strategic communications. It's around the engagement with our publics, where it's very clear the role of all the strategic communications is to make sure that our alliance is supported by our publics, but also that we have the next generation that is aware and knowledgeable about the role of alliance and supports it. It's also, when we look at how we do that, the whole set of most modern instruments. From one hand, of course, we have very military instruments, making sure that what we do on defense and deterrence is known to our adversaries and potential adversaries, and that they are aware that NATO is united, is committed, and that we have capabilities to defend and deter, from nuclear deterrence up until hybrid and cyber capabilities. When we look at engaging our publics, our civil society in direct dialogue, that's why we work with organizations such as GMF. That's why we work with Atlantic Council. That's why we have young Atlanticists all across the Atlantic. And we have supported many, many organizations in their wish to engage, because the most effective and efficient, of course, is when we have civil society, when we have media, when we have, small organizations, big organizations in our countries who work on behalf of NATO, meaning that they do the work to explain the alliance, the values, what we stand for. So it's not us from headquarters being parachuted in to teach our populations. No, it's our own allies, our own organizations, publics, and those people who understand, who bring more people around them. And there's a lot of voluntary work. There's a lot of interest, discussions. So our task, we support it from NATO headquarters. Of course, we have a lot of digital communications. If you look at NATO's website, there are some of the most innovative products that we have produced in terms of videos, in terms of films, to show what we do, how we do it, both in defense exercises, but also just, what type of people we have, cyber experts, for example, or pilots, or young women training dogs, military dogs. So there is a variety of tools and ideas that are there. And very clearly, our main target audience currently for the few years to come is our young leaders and the youth, because they will be the ones who will have to take over the leadership of the alliance and our countries in 2030.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Bruno, could I just add to that? I do think that, frankly, given the deliberate propaganda attempts to undermine the alliance and NATO itself, from right-wing platforms, we have them here in the United States with even Breitbart and Steve Bannon and people like that. They love pointing out, is the United States really going to go to war if the Russians invaded Estonia? That's the example they use to try to undermine Article 5 commitments. And so it seems to me we have to have a very sophisticated advocacy platform that talks about NATO, but talks about these shared values and what we're trying to build together, and why the cohesion and the logic of having the alliance is as important as ever. We had Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, come to speak before a joint session of Congress last year. That's the first time in 70 years that any Secretary General has been allowed or invited to speak to a joint session of the United States Congress. Got a lot of press, got a lot of interest, a lot of discussion about, well, what is NATO and why are we in it and what's it doing? And so that was a very useful thing to do. We've got to be more sophisticated in using social media platforms to push back and to propound the logic and common values and the collective security that undergird the logic of being in NATO and having a NATO. So I do think we have to take advantage of the social media platforms that exist and the civic engagement. We've got to renew civic engagement in member countries and would-be member countries, and even those not interested in being member countries, because the other side is actively doing that. And we must respond positively, proactively, not defensively, but we must respond. And that's why, for example, I do favor creating an actual center that articulates our commitments to democracy, to liberal institutions, to our shared values, and promotes it within NATO in a formal way.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to stay with you for a second, as a matter of fact. There are some more questions from a different caliber now, but many people are wondering about the next step now in transatlantic relations and what to do next year. So a question is, what would be your advice to President-elect Mr. Biden? Is it visiting Brussels and NATO headquarters? Or should we hold an alliance summit in the United States next year? Charles Michel, the president of the European Union, has invited President-elect Biden to hold a US summit. So should NATO do the same? What would be your advice?
Well, first of all, we are still in a pandemic, which is going to limit travel. Obviously, President-elect Biden is highly sensitive about that. The pandemic circumscribed his campaign. We did not have a normal campaign, in terms of getting out there and shaking hands and kissing babies and, you know, huge rallies and all that. And so that's going to have a lot to do with what options there are. But yes, I would absolutely recommend that he find an early opportunity to show the commitment, in fact, he has. Remember, President-elect Biden was, for a while, the chairman of the European Affairs Subcommittee on the Foreign Relations Committee, and then became chairman of the full committee. So he has a huge network in Europe, very committed to our European allies. And I think, I don't think he needs my advice. I think he will look for an early opportunity to make that very clear. But obviously there are policies that also speak even louder than a physical presence somewhere. And the president-elect has already said on day one, he's going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. He is going to reverse the decision for the United States to withdraw from the WHO. And he's going to look at trying to re-engage Iran and have the United States rejoin the JCPOA on the Iran nuclear agreement, so long as the Iranians agree to roll back some of the steps that have taken to enhance the nuclear development program. So I think these are very important decisions he's already indicated that he's going to undertake right away.
Thank you, Congressman. We're nearing almost the end of this event, but I think I want to take 2 or 3 more questions together, which are really concerned about the following issue. And basically, it's about how we assess European security architecture today. All the pillars and confidence-building measures that were put in place during the 90s have kind of disappeared. Think CFE treaty, it's gone. NATO Russia Founding Act, it's gone. INF treaty, gone. So how do we deal today with this lack of structures, this lack of confidence building mechanisms? So some people are wondering, for instance, related to this, do we need a new sort of INF treaty? 1. 2 is another question. Given this lack of confidence building measures, what do we do with the NATO-Russia Council? I mean, how, even though Russia is an adversary, how do we still talk with an adversary? Just, you know, in terms of limiting risk. So perhaps I would like to end with these set of questions. Start with you, Mr. Mesterházy, go to Ambassador Braže, and then I'll end with the Congressman. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I try to be short. Yeah, I think we should, or we must rebuild the multilateralism, because now we have, not just in the US during Mr. Trump, but some of the European countries, they have the approach that it's a very nationalistic approach. They say that we put our nation first, as Mr. Trump did it before, and they believe the nation states, not the multilateralism. And I think that's a big problem. So we have to rebuild, you know, the credibility or the image of multilateralism, that it helps a country, and it's not an obstacle to represent your national interests. So I think that's one important point. And of course, we can you know, fight against populism with this kind of rebuilding the credibility of this and the image of multilateralism. The other thing is, it was very interesting because there was an idea, and some of the members in the PA just came up with that we should, you know, create a NATO-China Council also, which will not, you know, take place, but still it's an interesting idea, because of course the NATO-Russia Council doesn't work, and it was not efficient either. But perhaps it's true that the Chinese has different approach regarding the dialogue and all these kind of issues. So I think it makes sense to find some new channels for dialogue. As we always say, that we should keep a gate open for the dialogue, but it doesn't mean that we do not notice what has happened before. And we cannot accept the fact that if someone doesn't respect the rules of the international order. So that's what we always keep in mind, that we should have dialogue, But on the other hand, we have to keep in mind that what was not fulfilled or delivered as we agreed regarding Russia or China or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador.
On the NATO-Russia Council, quite clearly that while NATO has said quite a number of times that we are open to the dialogue, and we are the ones who have clearly indicated that Russia is very welcome to continue the dialogue, we haven't been met with much response. So when we look back at the history of NATO-Russia's relations, just remember in 2010, the Russian president was participating in NATO summit. And so Mr. Putin was also in Bucharest summit. So relations go up and down. Currently, after Russia's systemic violations of international law, obviously the business as usual is not possible. So the NRC meetings, the formal political meetings were discontinued, but we remain open to the dialogue and it's happening. NATO maintains its information office in Moscow, military liaison office. There's a lot of engagement on so-called track 2 with public organizations and think tankers and media. When it was still possible, we brought Russian civil society and think tankers and media over to NATO headquarters for visits and for discussions. So we make sure that there is a dialogue track as far as NATO is concerned. The multilateral order, yes, the international system of rule of law and fulfilling, what it means is fulfilling commitments that states have undertaken. And they have entered these commitments of their free will. Nobody has forced them. And of course, it is their will and their willingness to fulfill them that makes this international system work. Russia has not done that. It was party to the INF. It violated INF. It was party to the and committed to the OSCE principles, and still it violated the borders of independent country and annexed part of it, and supports a violent conflict in eastern Ukraine. So there are a lot of questions about the multilateral order. However, I would like also to stress that we have to have a multi-stakeholder approach, and NATO is a multilateral organization itself. Our audience research shows that, again, especially young people are in favor of even more international cooperation to address these big challenges that we have. But we also have to have so-called multi-stakeholder approach, where we, in our decision-making, involve private sector, academia, civil societies, so that all those who have stakes in the success of our societies are also part of the decision-making. And this is where we are different as democratic states from China or others, because they mostly regard multilateral approach as only being run by the governments, not by the whole multi-stakeholder involvement. And on NATO EU, yes, we are working very closely. There has never been a closer cooperation than it is now, and it's on all these global challenges, including the disinformation and countering it, including on understanding the hybrid threats, which involve also energy security, which involve illegal financing of various organizations. It involves, of course, cyber and many other types of activities. And yes, there is a complementarity also in political efforts, even though there is no scenario. For example, on East Med, NATO ensured that there is military deconfliction mechanism so that two allies would not enter into some type of military conflict, while the EU is trying to make sure that there is also a wider negotiation and mediation on issues around continental shelf and issues around that. So we work with everyone. There's nothing like the transatlantic link and the strong involvement of our North American allies, both Canada and the US, with our European allies, that make sure that we can continue to provide security for our 1 billion citizens as we are currently.
Thank you, Ambassador. Congressman Connolly, the final honors are for you, and if you have some thoughts on this European...
I do.
Okay,
Thank you. Look, even during the height of the Cold War, we've got experience of operating in parallel tracks. So where we felt it was in our mutual self-interest to engage and to create architecture to avoid conflict or to promote cooperation, especially in technical areas, we did so. Currently, we have an adversarial relationship with Russia, but we cooperate on space. We can and should cooperate on the environment. There are economic matters we continue to cooperate on. So we have a long experience in being able to do both. But I agree with the ambassador that I think implied in her comments, if we know a priori that the Russians or the Chinese are not going to, in fact, abide by the terms of a treaty or an agreement that we put forward, then let's not be naive. Let's not even do that. We have to have clear assurances and mechanisms for enforcement and verification on any kinds of agreements with a country like Russia and with a country like China. And I think we can do that. And one model of dealing with adversaries for a common purpose was the Iran nuclear agreement. We had China, Russia, the EU, the United States, and Iran for the first time at that table. And we created mechanisms for enforcement. And the Iranians actually complied with all of the terms of that agreement until the United States pulled out. So we do have a model of an enforceable agreement that is in everybody's collective interest, and it even brought together foes normally around that common purpose. So I think we should look for those opportunities, but never be naive and don't ever show weakness. I mean, we've got to go into those kinds of engagements with intestinal fortitude. I think it was Frederick Greig that said, "L'audace, l'audace, toujours l'audace."
Très bien. Well, we are at the end of our time, unfortunately, but I do thank you all speakers for your very interesting interventions. Thank you to you viewers. I'm sorry there's no more time for more questions, but I do congratulate you on the issues that you raised. Clearly, we had our own little reflection process here during the last hour, but there are many issues at stake that NATO will have to think about. And I think each one of these issues deserves an event of its own. So I hope that we will have the opportunity to come together. I'm sure we will. I wish to thank again also our partners in NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you very much for your support in this event. I also wish to thank my own team, especially Alexandria Chastenet, who has really been the glue on our end. So thank you viewers, and I wish you all a good evening or a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.